Welcome to the deep dive. This one, well, it gets pretty intense. Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into a really significant disagreement between two prominent public intellectuals. It all kicked off from a pretty stark thought experiment, the hypothetical assassination of Charlie Kirk, a figure who's definitely controversial. The source material we're looking at is this raw, quite honest conversation that just balloons outwards, into these huge questions about political strategy, morality, and failure.
That's right. And our goal here is really to get at the core tension they were wrestling with. It's less about Kirk himself and more about this fundamental clash. Strategy versus morality. When does doing what you need to do politically, like building a coalition, cross the line into, well, moral betrayal?
Right. And the flip side, when does sticking rigidly to the moral high ground actually become strategically self-defeating?
Exactly. They're grappling with some massive questions. How did this broad coalition, let's call it the left for simplicity, end up losing so much ground, thinking about 2016 and then the really big losses in 2024?
Yeah, what went wrong? What was the fundamental flaw in the approach that let opponents gain so much traction?
And the conversation really forces you to confront the complexity around political violence. It's this balancing act, isn't it? On one hand, there's this urgent need to de-escalate things, especially now when it feels like political attacks are just crossing all sorts of lines. But on the other hand, there's this deeply felt moral need to hold people accountable for what many see as, persistent, organized hate speech.
Okay, so let's start right at that flashpoint. The initial reaction to the hypothetical killing. The host of the original discussion, he explained, his first instinct was just horror. And this feeling that they needed to immediately de-escalate. His argument was, look, when you witness a public murder and you see the actual grief of the people who, loved this person, even a controversial one, the human instinct, or maybe the political one, is to kind of step back, sit with them in their grief, as he put it, and just cool the temperature down.
Right. The motivation seems clearly rooted in crisis management. They talked about this idea of violence being contagious.
Yeah, they brought up the attack on Paul Pelosi, the near miss with Donald Trump, Steve Scalise getting shot.
Exactly. The point was that if you stay silent in that moment, you risk kind of validating this cycle of violence. He felt strongly that a voice from the literal side needed to see clearly that political violence is an attack on us all.
Which, focusing purely on keeping civil society intact and stopping bloodshed, that's a powerful argument. But the counter-argument that came back was incredibly sharp.
Yeah, very pointed. It was basically, you absolutely have to differentiate how people die versus how they live. The critic pointed out, based on their research for the piece, that this figure, Kirk, had a public record just filled with rhetoric that allegedly slurred across the board all sorts of groups of people, and that he ran an organization widely viewed as a haven of hatred.
So the critique was essentially, look, if someone's legacy is built on spreading hate, then celebrating their politics, even for a moment, even for unity after they die violently, it fundamentally compromises the moral core of your own movement.
And that initial response piece, it was harsh. It compared the host's reaction to the whitewashing of the Southern cause after the Civil War.
Wow.
Which is, pretty loaded language. It basically means choosing political reconciliation over facing up to historical and moral truth.
That's a heavy comparison. It implies the de-escalation effort wasn't just strategy, it was moral erasure. And it really forces you, the listener, to grapple with that core issue. Should strategic cooling down ever trump the moral truth in someone's public life?
Exactly. And that ethical split immediately pivots into what might be the more critical question, strategically speaking. If this figure's rhetoric was so based on hate, how is he also seen as such a successful political actor?
Yeah, why was he winning? Despite all these deep moral objections, why was he gaining ground electorally, culturally?
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the conversation homes in on this idea that maybe the broader coalition opposing figures like him has, in a way, stopped doing politics.
Stopped doing politics? How so?
Well, crucially, by writing a lot of people off.
Okay, writing people off. What does that look like? Give us an example.
The source points directly to Hillary Clinton's basket of deplorables comment. Remember that?
Oh, yeah. Racist, sexist, xenophobic.
Right. But specifically her line, some of those folks, they are irredeemable. That phrasing, whether intended or not, sent a message to a big chunk of the population. You're beyond reach. We're not even trying to engage you politically.
But it wasn't just about labels, was it? The argument was deeper, about actual disengagement.
Exactly. They cite examples of what they term counterproductive disengagement. This is where the messy, sometimes unpleasant work of politics starts getting, well, demeaned because people demand absolute moral purity.
Like what?
Like the huge backlash Bernie Sanders got for going on Joe Rogan's podcast, because Rogan had made transphobic comments.
Right, I remember that.
Or Elizabeth Warren facing criticism for appearing on Bill Maher's show, given his history of comments seen as Islamophobic.
Okay, so the argument is that refusing to engage, even with platforms or people you find morally objectionable, is strategically damaging.
That's the tension, yeah.
Mhm.
Because the intellectual, the critic in this case, sees their primary job as holding that moral line. He explicitly says, I shouldn't be running for president. His role is different, meaning the intellectual's job is to reject dehumanization, to call out slurs. He argues he just can't stand by and watch someone weaponize hatred in the name of unity, even a temporary post-mortem unity.
But why is making that specific moral statement so critical in that exact moment? Why not focus purely on the violence?
Because, he argues, the words themselves have real devastating impacts on vulnerable people. He specifically mentions the effect of someone like Kirk's rhetoric on, say, trans kids or Haitian immigrants in Ohio.
Okay.
So the writer feels this profound obligation to use their platform to say, essentially, I see your pain, this rhetoric is harmful, and this dude was wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Now, he absolutely acknowledges the political reality. Losing elections has terrible consequences for those very same people, like their rights getting rolled back.
Right.
But he argues that abandoning the moral line, even strategically, ultimately weakens the coalition's foundation in the long run.
So to understand maybe why winning feels so hard, the discussion then kind of zooms out historically. The critic emphasizes that this whole struggle for equality, it's up against some really, really powerful forces of history and powerful narratives.
Yeah, he points to the level of racial resentment, just the visceral reaction around Barack Obama, as pretty recent proof that these deep-seated opposing forces don't just evaporate. You don't just elect one person and solve it. And we need to be realistic about the scale of the challenge. Historically speaking, he notes, political violence has often been the norm, not the exception, for the Black experience in America. So the point is recognizing this isn't some new fight against a polite opposition that suddenly got nasty. This is the fight, historically.
That historical view, though, doesn't it risk making the present feel, I don't know, too deterministic? Like if we're just battling these massive historical tides that always pull us back, what's the point of focusing on immediate strategy?
He pushes back on that. He says it's not fatalism, it's recognition. It's not about giving up. It's about knowing what you're truly facing. You must not underestimate what you are up against. And he connects it to this long lineage, right? People who fought with all their might against enormous evils like child slavery.
Yeah.
And they never saw the victory in their lifetimes. The goal, then, isn't necessarily final victory tomorrow, but to make a meaningful contribution now, recognizing the fight is long.
I get that long view, I do. But the host counters that this focus on, let's say, historical inertia, maybe lets people off the hook for clear strategic mistakes made just in the last, say, 8 to 12 years, mistakes that had consequences. The 2024 loss, he argues, directly led to a much more dangerous form of politics fully erupting.
And you can see that strategic failure in concrete terms. They talk about this alarming decline in basic political competitiveness. There's this line, it's become easier to imagine the end of the country than winning a Senate seat in Missouri or Arkansas.
Oof, that's stark.
It is. And that kind of decline, the argument goes, reflects actual strategic decisions they made and decisions we made. It demands a really disciplined strategic rethinking.
And that rethinking, it seems, involves having to, quote, raise the status of just like old-fashioned politics. Meaning we need to value the grubby compromises that are sometimes necessary to actually win and wield power.
Yes. And this is where that distinction between the writer, the intellectual, and the politician becomes crystal clear. The politician often have to make deals that the moral commentator would, and maybe should, find deeply unpalatable.
History gives us examples, right?
Painful ones.
Yeah.
FDR and the New Deal. To get it passed, he essentially cut a deal with Southern Democrats that excluded many Black people from key benefits.
That was the price of getting the thing done. A huge political win, but a definite moral compromise.
Absolutely. Or the Obama example they use. In 2008, to win the presidency, he ran publicly opposing gay marriage.
Which seems unthinkable now, but...
But the argument is that this tactical move, this moral compromise at the time, gave him the power to later appoint Supreme Court justices. And those justices were key to establishing the constitutional right to same-sex marriage down the line.
So the insight there is kind of chilling. For the politician, maybe morality isn't the tool you use to get power, but something you exercise after you have it.
That seems to be the argument being made. And that, the critic says, is precisely why the intellectual's role is so vital. If the politician's job is, say, to get the New Deal done, by whatever means necessary, then the writer's job is to stand on the sidelines and yell at FDR to not do that. Because that moral yelling, that constant pressure, is maybe the only thing keeping the politician somewhat accountable to the most vulnerable parts of their coalition.
Which brings up that hard truth, doesn't it? That politics so often is just choosing the lesser of two evils.
It really is. The critic used a more current example, thinking about Kamala Harris's stance on Gaza during the campaign. Many progressives felt, deeply uncomfortable, even betrayed by her position.
Right.
But the political calculation for many was that voting for her was still necessary because the alternative was seen as far worse.
Yeah.
The politician has to make that call. But the writer, they have that separate but equally crucial job to explain that painful calculation, to justify why that compromise, which feels like a moral sacrifice to some communities, is deemed necessary, to speak to those vulnerable groups who feel like their core concerns just got traded away.
So the conclusion on roles is pretty clear then. We don't all have the same role. The writer speaks the truth as they see it. The politician builds the coalition, makes the deals.
Exactly.
But the host pulls it back to urgency. He argues we desperately need to prioritize strategy now because the broader political culture has just deteriorated so badly. Things are acceptable now, like, say, the public behavior of someone like Trump that would have been career-ending not long ago.
And if political strategy is downstream from political culture, as the saying goes.
Right. If the culture is broken, your strategy has to adapt, maybe radically.
Which leads to exploring these really uncomfortable strategic ideas, like the notion floated of maybe running candidates who are intentionally moderate, or maybe even, say, pro-life Democrats in very specific red states.
Just to win power.
Just to win power. Because the argument is the cost of losing power has become so horrifying and dangerous for the people the coalition wants to protect.
To put that danger in perspective, though, the critic offers one last historical reality check. He reminds everyone, look, this current moment, it's bad, but it's not the worst in American history regarding freedom and basic democratic function.
What does he compare it to?
He points to Reconstruction. That brief, incredibly fragile period after the Civil War, an attempt at multiracial democracy that was ultimately crushed by violence, that's the closest parallel he sees.
Wow.
And he closes his side of it with this really powerful, almost meditative thought. He references a Buddhist idea applied to political struggle. We are of the nature to lose. How then shall we live and love? Meaning, you have to approach the fight with full commitment, knowing loss is possible, even likely sometimes. But moral consistency has to remain the foundation, even if tactical victory feels far off.
That's a heavy note to end on. This whole conversation was clearly drawing on a lot of deep context. For listeners wanting to dig deeper, I actually have 3 book recommendations that came up or really informed this kind of thinking.
Okay, great. Let's hear them.
First is The Brothers by Stephen Kinzer. It's about Alan and John Foster Dulles and their roles, basically, in overthrowing governments during the Eisenhower years. It's a stark look at how raw American power has been wielded.
Okay, power in action. What's next?
Second, David Blight's Race and Reunion, essential reading. It's about how America, especially after the Civil War, deliberately constructed a narrative of reunion by essentially forgetting, or whitewashing, the actual causes and consequences of the war, particularly slavery and racial injustice.
So that directly connects to that earlier comparison about the reaction to Kirk's death.
Precisely. It shows how forgetting history serves a political purpose, often a problematic one. And third, a book by Chris Hayes called Siren's Call. It's about social media, our screens, the attention economy.
Very relevant today.
Totally relevant, especially to that point about political strategy being downstream from political culture and why getting anyone's sustained attention for complex political arguments is so incredibly difficult now.
Those sound like excellent follow-ups. Okay. So what does this all mean for you, the listener?
What's the takeaway here?
Well, the core conflict we explored today, it seems to be this deep tension, right? Between the pull of immediate moral clarity, the need to condemn what you see as hate right now, and the messy, often compromising long-term work needed to actually gain and use political power. Power that might be the only way to truly protect the very groups harmed by that hate speech.
it really highlights how fragile those 20th century political norms, those guardrails we thought were solid, actually were.
Yeah, and they seem to be collapsing around us. So if politics is this constant battle over who gets to draw the moral lines, and those lines themselves are becoming blurred or erased, it leaves you with a tough question. In your own political life, your own engagement, what do you prioritize when those things conflict? Is it unwavering moral consistency, even if it means losing? Or is it tactical victory, even if it requires uncomfortable compromises?
That's definitely a question worth wrestling with. Thanks for joining us for the deep dive.